Today, by looking at many wonderful tapestries in the collection, I'll show you a bit about the fun I have as a Billedvev design detective. Billedvev is the Norwegian word for tapestry, and it literally means picture weaving. This conversation will not be a full history of Norwegian tapestry. Rather, it is an appreciation of the tapestries owned by Vesterheim Norwegian American Museum. I'm sure it's the finest collection of tapestries from Norway in the United States. Next slide. In this talk, you can be a Billedvev detective along with me. Here's a handsome Norwegian detective. The ones on TV see a lot of murder and blood, but some tapestries have a violent bent as well. Next slide. In this tapestry owned by Vesterheim, designed by Gerhard Mundt, Thor is holding a hammer and a Viking warrior yields a bloody sword in the Battle of Hjørungavåg. Gerhard Mundt painted many illustrations based on fairy tales and Norwegian history that became tapestries. He also designed for porcelain, silver, and wood. This tapestry was one of his many artworks based on the Norwegian Snorre sagas recorded in the 1200s. A recent book on Mundt said that his Snorre illustrations were the most reproduced of all of his works, and that he probably considered them his most Norwegian works. This image is fabulous as a tapestry. I love the strong diagonal slashes of color. While Gerhard Mundt was a well-known artist and designer of the tapestries, the name of the weaver is sometimes missing. It's too bad when the talented weavers who interpreted his works aren't recognized. Next slide. Billedvev has been an important and appreciated art form in Norway. I'm going to talk about works from 3 different time periods, and you'll see from our investigation that there are recurring themes and motifs over many hundreds of years. As a preview, here you see a detail from the Baldus Old Tapestry on the left from 1180. In the center is a piece from a tapestry around 1600, and on the right, a tapestry from the National Romantic period around the turn of the 20th century. These are the 3 time periods I'm going to mention. Next slide. This is a copy of the Baldus Old Tapestry. The original has been dated to around 1180. There are some older pictorial textiles in Norway, but this is the oldest existing tapestry and one of the oldest in all of Europe. It's a true Norwegian treasure, and when the new National Museum opens in Oslo next summer, the Baldus Old will be displayed prominently on the first floor. This history lesson talk focuses on tapestries owned by Vesterheim. Of course, the museum doesn't own the original Baldus Old Tapestry, but it does own 3 full-size replicas, which is amazing. It's amazing that a weaver would choose to take on this task because the Baldus Old Tapestry is large. It's 46 inches high and 90 inches wide. The images represent 2 months of the year, April and May, and it's likely that there were originally panels depicting all 12 months. The tapestry has been reproduced many times, and it's amazing that 3 of them have been donated to Vesterheim. In 1925, the Norse American Centennial Celebration was held in St. Paul, and President and Mrs. Calvin Coolidge came. The next year, a group of Norwegian American women raised money for a copy of the Baldus Old Tapestry to be woven for the president and his wife, and it was presented to them at the White House. This replica was woven by Alma Amelie Gutterson of St. Paul, Minnesota, who was inspired by seeing the replica given to the president. Gutterson traveled to Norway to learn tapestry weaving and had her yarns dyed there. For our detective work with the Vesterheim tapestries, I'd like to point out some motifs. You might see them later. The April man is sowing seeds. They're flowing from his hand that's going down, and there are birds flanking him. His elongated face was often woven by students in Scandinavian weaving schools, and it looks like many of the depictions of Jesus. A man on a horse is in the May panel. Notice that both of the figures are placed under arches and between columns. And there is a meandering ribbon-like pattern along the bottom of the tapestry. Next slide. So after the Baldus, there were no known tapestries in Norway until the time of the golden age of tapestry in Norway, from about the mid-1550s to the early 1700s. Tapestry weaving likely came to Norway with German or Flemish itinerant weavers. A strong professional guild-based system never formed in Norway. In many cases, women of means on larger farms or in towns became weavers. Most of the large tapestries were on religious themes. The most popular theme was the Wise and Foolish Virgins, in which a row of wise virgins hold up their lamps filled with oil. The foolish and they're waiting for the bridegroom. The foolish virgins used all the oil in their lamps, and instead they're crying into their handkerchiefs. The Wise and Foolish Virgin tapestries were often woven as bridal coverlets, and there was a moral message included. Not only did a bride need to be pure and innocent, she needed to be alert and vigilant. The cartoons, or the patterns that weavers would place behind the threads to weave the images, were copied many times. These images might get distorted over time. Sometimes rows of lettering became illegible shapes. Plus, some weavers had more skill than others. Overall, the Norwegian tapestries gained a distinctive, somewhat naive look compared to continental tapestries. They were filled with shading and could resemble a realistic painting. Norwegian tapestries had little shading. They were composed of flat areas of color, often with outlining. The Norwegian tapestries had some other distinctive characteristics. In contrast to European tapestries that had tails of threads hanging on the back, Norwegian weavers would weave in the ends so that the front was as beautiful as the back. This may have been because larger tapestries were used as coverlets. Also, while a European weaver might leave long vertical slits and sew them up afterwards, Norwegian weavers used a variety of decorative joins. Again, this might have been to keep the fabric strong if it was used as a coverlet. This tapestry is filled with marvelous pattern. The skirts of the women are geometric gems. The border is one that is found in many Norwegian tapestries, a series of stars with the meandering vine around them. You'll see this again. It's a Bible story, so the women are probably in Jerusalem, and the city is indicated by a series of rectangles on top of the women in the upper row. Next slide. Vesterheim is lucky to own such an old and important tapestry. I mentioned that the religious-based designs were reproduced many times. This slide shows that the National Museum in Oslo has 7 virgin tapestries. They're all filled with wonderful pattern and varying levels of abstraction. Next slide. I mentioned before that tapestry is an important art form in Norway. During the National Romantic period, during the late 1800s, and especially up to the time that Norway separated from Sweden in 1905, Norwegian artists were looking towards crafts and images they felt were purely Norwegian. There was great interest in the tapestries woven centuries before. This is a photo of a tapestry from the early 1900s that's based on the Wise and Foolish Virgins, but just the wise ones this time. Again, we see the pattern filling the clothing of the figures in the background. We see a beautiful border that contains the image. One time when we had this tapestry out on display for one of my workshops in weaving in the Billedvev style, I decided to take photos of the faces in this one. I thought perhaps the students might find inspiration to weave faces in their own tapestries. Next slide. I was amazed to find that the faces in the figures were almost completely identical and perfect on the front and back. I found that interesting because I think a lively aspect of the historical tapestries is sometimes the imperfections. This newer virgin tapestry is impeccably woven, but to me, it's not quite as appealing as the older ones. Next slide. Another treasure in the Vesterheim collection is a historical tapestry of the Adoration of the Magi. You see the three kings on wonderful horses. Someone once mentioned that they look like Norwegian fjord horses with striped manes, and that those were probably not the breed ridden by the three wise men back in the Holy Land. Remember the star border? You see it again here. Stars are so popular in the old tapestries, both the full stars with the 8 segments and a type of star that is made just with crossed lines. So if you look in this tapestry, there is a vertical line that splits the tapestry in half, and those stars made with crossed lines are down that line. Next slide. And again, this was such a popular religious image in the 1500s and 1600s. The National Museum in Oslo has 7 of these Adoration of the Magi tapestries also. You can see that 2 of them have the same 4-square format as the Vesterheim tapestry. Others have a central image with an ovalish border around it that's filled with fabulous abstracted animals. Next slide. This is my tapestry, completed at the beginning of 2020. I had been planning to weave a blue or a green or a red horse for some time. This horse doesn't carry one of the wise men or a queen, but my daughter Margaret wielding a cell phone. She doesn't have a ruff. Instead, a scarf is tied at her neck. She has brown curly hair, but no crown. Next slide. When I added a pattern-filled background to this one, I borrowed motifs from different historical Norwegian tapestries, all of those diamond and comb shapes that you see. Several old tapestries included a tree to one side, and I love the diamond-shaped leaves on these trees. If you look carefully on the trunk of my tree, you'll see something that reflects all of the podcasts I was listening to while I was weaving about privacy and technology. A surveillance camera is near the top. Next slide. My tapestry is about the same size as one of the panels on the Vesterheim Adoration of the Magi tapestry, about 21 inches wide by 24 inches tall. Next slide. Okay, so now we can use our detective skills while we appreciate another tapestry in the Vesterheim collection, a horse and rider cushion-sized tapestry from 1929. It includes a wonderful bird and fox and rabbit too that you can find. There are words at the top of this tapestry that translate roughly as, "And then I rode forth over the difficult miles." The inscription refers to a line from the folktale Greven og Lille Lise from Denmark. I'll bet you can see right off that there are similarities to the historical tapestries from around the 1600s. I'll set the newer tapestry next to a portion of the Adoration of the Magi tapestry. Next slide. They both include a horse and rider. There's even the set of 3 solid lines on the rumps of the horses. I thought these might be tassels from a blanket. Tapestry weaver Laura Birdlodge had more information. She wrote, "Some medieval and Renaissance saddles had tail straps that attached to the back of the saddle for stability. From this strap hung decorative bands that also doubled to help chase off flies that would want to bite the horse." So those 3 lines on the back, those are fly chasers. The foliage in the pieces, these 2 pieces, is quite similar. Look at the plant in front of the horse's front legs in both images. In the older piece, look at the interlocking wave motif along the border in front of the horse. It's hard to see, but on the 2 vertical borders of the newer tapestry, there is that same broken wave pattern, but it's difficult to see because the border is almost the same color as the background. Next slide. But not only did the 1929 tapestry reflect back to the 1600s, it also took elements from the Baldus Old Tapestry of 1180. Remember when we looked at the old one and we saw the arches framing the two figures and the columns that flank them? So the newer one has just that same arch and column motif. And they both have that same ribbon-like border along the bottom. It's a little bit more abstracted in the newer one. Next slide. So near the beginning, we saw a Gerhard Mundt design with Thor and a bloody sword. I'd like to point out the other Mundt tapestries owned by Vesterheim. In the story of Liti Kjersti, Kjersti has been taken to the underworld by the evil elf king. The elf king asks her where she was born and raised, and she says Norway. Then the elf king's daughter brings her a glass of wine with 3 seeds in it. And when Kjersti drinks it, the elf king asks her again where she was born and raised, and this time she says the underworld. This image is quite different from the religious tapestries of centuries before, yet it retains a Norwegian feel. Again, there are areas of flat color with outlining and broad borders. Exuberant pattern continues. I love the goats on the bottom border of this one with impossibly long curved horns. Next slide. Lauren Gilbertson, curator at Vesterheim, wrote an article with Kathleen Stocker about the Gerhard Mundt tapestries, and we'll send you a link. They pointed out that the fairy tales often had a theme of 3. In this tapestry, 3 beautiful princesses are kidnapped by trolls. The trolls throw the key out the castle window and then turn their sweethearts, 3 brothers, into a deer, a fish, and a bird. Years later, the bird finds the key and with the help of the deer and fish, unlocks the castle door. The princesses recognize their sweethearts, who instantly return to their human forms. So we're now in the National Romantic period, and Mundt was creating works that he felt were very Norwegian. Lauren also wrote in the Vesterheim article, he believed that the new national weavings should have rough yarn so that they would resemble the old homespun textiles. He wanted the colors that he felt were traditional and Norwegian: crimson, red violet, indigo blue, blue-green, and brass gold. He cared only that the colors were beautiful, lasting, and applied according to the Norwegian national aesthetic. It wasn't so important that the dye stuffs were historical. On this point, he differed from other weaving revivalists who were busy promoting indigenous plant dyes. Looking closely at this tapestry, I particularly like the red outlining of the elk. Seems kind of modern from the black outlining of the historical tapestries. And I like the long noses of the creepy trolls in the upper right-hand corner. Next slide. Sometimes the stories about the tapestries are as interesting as the stories they depict. The 3 Brothers was a gift to the Deaconess Hospital in Park Ridge, Illinois in 1908 or 1909, only a couple of years after this photo of Norwegian King Håkon and Queen Maud was taken. The hospital had asked for a donation for fundraising, and then later the tapestry came to Vesterheim. I showed this photo to my friend Lisa Torvik, who said, "Oh, Queen Maud, she was so proud of her 18-inch waist." Next slide. And here's the final Gerhard Mundt tapestry at Vesterheim, woven between 1934 and 1939 by a weaver with the initials OR. It was woven and sold through Husflid, or the Norwegian Home Craft Association. This pattern, the Golden Birds, was first woven in 1899. Mundt's patterns were sold through Husflid, and by the 1930s, when the Vesterheim's Golden Birds was woven, more than 100 Mundt tapestries had been woven. Next slide. So you could compare Norwegian tapestry to a good detective series in which new works build on the characters and motifs in earlier books. I'd like to show you a few details from a work by a more contemporary artist. The Red Thread by Else Marie Jacobsen is a monumental work in the Science Building at the University of Bergen. It's in a heavy, blocky concrete building in brutalist style. And when Else Marie Jacobsen entered the competition for art for the building in the late 1970s, she wanted something that would soften it. She wanted to pay homage to the work of women. She highlighted known tapestry weavers and all of the unknown tapestry weavers of previous centuries. With what you've seen so far, you'll recognize a couple of the familiar motifs. Next slide. Here are two segments, and you see a man and you see a woman. Next slide. Ah, we meet a foolish virgin again. You can tell by the handkerchief dangling from her hand. Next slide. And the man, here's the April man of the Baldus Old Tapestry again, with the birds beside him and the same flowing foliage. Next slide. So thank you for coming along on this short detective hunt, featuring and highlighting tapestries from the Vesterheim Norwegian American Museum. Next slide.
Thank you again, Robbie, for being here. We are so grateful and look forward to working with you again in the future.